I'm Victoria Grazia, a professor of history here at Columbia, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you to this book launch for Martha Graham's Cold War, The Dance of American Diplomacy, beautiful title, which was just published by Oxford University Press. And it's an enormous pleasure to start this spring semester with this wonderful book and presenting it in the presence of Victoria Phillips and her friends and her relatives, and we'll go on and on about that. Martha Graham's Cold War explores the international political life of Martha Graham to promote the United States in more than 30 nations for every presidential administration from Franklin D. Roosevelt through George H.W. Bush. We're going to discuss that book we're delighted to be hosting this tonight, and we're going to have three panelists who are going to discuss this book with us, Lynn Garafola, Whitney Laemmli, and Richard John. Victoria is a lecturer in history at the European Institute and Department of History, colleague, and associated faculty at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. As you know, some of you, she specializes in Cold War history and cultural diplomacy. In addition to her history courses, Victoria founded and still leads the Cold War Archival Research Project and takes advanced students from Columbia, the LSE, and West Point to archives in the United States and Europe to conduct primary research on Cold War power. An extraordinary program which has been flourishing now every year more over the last 4 years. She will be this spring a visiting professor at the Institute of International Relations and a distinguished fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Corvinus University in Budapest. Before her academic career, and also before a first career on Wall Street, Victoria was trained as a professional dancer. She took company class with Martha Graham and learned core roles in key works by Graham. She brings through her research on Martha Graham then the skills of the historian, trained at Columbia University, I should say, and the knowledge of the dancer. To discuss Victoria's book, we're very fortunate to have with us Lynn Garafola, who's professor Emerita of dance at Barnard College. Lynn guided Victoria's work from her time as a student in her history classes at Barnard through her PhD dissertation. Lynn is a dance historian and critic, the author of Iago's Ballet Russe and Legacies of 20th Century Dance. She's a regular contributor of articles and essays to both scholarly and general interest publications. She's the former editor of the book series, Studies in Dance History, and the founder of the Columbia University seminar, Studies in Dance. These pages are a little bit confused, I'm so sorry. We're also privileged to welcome Whitney Laemmli, who's assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Whitney is also a historian, but of modern science and technology. Her research explores the interactions between technical practice, the arts, and political life in the United States and Europe. And she's currently working on a book manuscript titled Measured Movements, the Human Body and the Choreography of Modern Life. Before joining Carnegie Mellon, Whitney was a member of the Society of Fellows in Humanities at Columbia University. It's also a great pleasure to have here Richard John, who's professor of journalism at Columbia University. Richard specializes in the history of business, technology, communications, and American political development. He teaches courses here on history of capitalism and history of communications. His publications include many essays, a number of edited books, and two notable monographs spreading the news. I'm afraid the pages are a little bit. On American Postal System from Franklin to Morse, and Network Nation, more recent, inventing American telecommunications. So, thank you, Victoria. Thank Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Richard, for being with us this evening. And I want to thank the sponsors of the European Institute, the Harriman Institute for Department of History, ISERP, that's the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy, and the Society of Fellows, and Hayman Center for the Humanities. We're very poor on this. We have to put all these monies together to get them and bring us all together for the right. Victoria's going to start with the presentation of her book, then Lynn, Whitney, and Richard will make their comments, and then we'll have a discussion with the panelists and a question and answer session with the audience. But before I introduce Victoria, she's going to come up. I'm going to introduce the book in its most vivid form. I remember when I did my first book, this beautiful binding. Oxford did a brilliant job. Pages will never fall out. And there were also wonderful illustrations, which any editor will tell you cost a lot. But I want to call another thing to your attention. I mean, it's a remarkable work of scholarship and beautifully written and edited. And it's got, you can see, very, very scholarly work. This is the notes. And this is the text. And I especially wanted to call attention to this green piece. This is the acknowledgments, 14 pages. Now, I only want to say about this. It's an essay in itself. We might call it a postopography among historians. That is sort of a collective biography of friends of Victoria Phillips. And those of you who are mentioned here, but those of you who may be admirers and fans in the wider and wider circle, which she will reach because as she travels around the world, will know that Victoria asks 100% of her friends. Her friends have to give back 120%, and then she gives back 160% or 200%. Also for that reason, we're here to celebrate Victoria's book. Victoria, where you are. I think that Victoria won't come up until we've shown the video. Okay, thank you.
I've spent all my life with dance and being a dancer. It's permitting life to use you in a very intense way. Sometimes it's not pleasant, sometimes it's fearful, but nonetheless it's inevitable.
Martha Graham was one of the great American artists of the 20th century. She changed dance. She invented a new language of movement and used it to reveal the passion, the rage, and the ecstasy common to human experience. She choreographed and danced for 70 years. She was the first dancer ever to perform at the White House. She was the first dancer to receive America's highest civilian award, the Medal of Freedom, and the first to tour abroad as a cultural ambassador. She received every honor, from the key to the city of Paris to Japan's Imperial Order of the Precious Crown. Once, a young man attracted by the crowd around her asked for her autograph. She obliged. He thanked her and added, "But who are you?" She snatched back the piece of paper and said, "Find out."
I just wanted to start by thanking everyone here. It's such an honor and a privilege to be here, and really a dream that I never thought would be realized. I want to specifically thank the European Institute. This is a really great show, tape and all of this. And also for hosting me as a professor, hosting the Cold War Archival Research Program. And I want to thank the Department of History, of course, at Columbia and Columbia University, where I've received numerous degrees and actually followed up on this one. It's a real honor to be here. Blanche Wiesen-Cook says often that I never go anywhere without my gang. I love that, and not to get political, but this gang is a village, it does, it takes a village. And my work would not be possible without so many voices. When I saw the tape, many of those dancers gave testimony for the book. And so this was a process, it was an archival process, but it was also a process where we literally made archives with oral histories, with papers under beds that I wheeled Ethel Winter's papers. She was a great dancer, and her husband stage managed the first tour, which I learned as I was doing the oral history with her. He chimed in, no, that's when I made the stage in Burma, because there wasn't one. I thought, well, we better include him on this conversation. And they were nice enough to pull out their papers and ask me if I would please take them to the Library of Congress, but only if I would wheel them myself. So there I was in the train with my suitcase, actually 2 suitcases. So that's the kind of making history that I've been able to do, but only because of the village and most of you in this room. So I thank everyone, and there are surely people left out in the acknowledgements, and I apologize. So yes, so oftentimes I have to begin a conversation with, who is Martha Graham anyway? It's particularly important for people who didn't live during her time, but also older people. There are people, sometimes I'll be in a taxi cab and somebody will say, well, what are you doing here in Alabama or somewhere? Or actually even in Paris, this happened. And I don't want to explain who Martha Graham is. Well, I'm here to give a talk on the Cold War. What's that? I'm here. So that's when I know that I'm really starting at the beginning. So I often start with this postage stamp of Martha Graham, which is obviously connects her to the government, but I think it speaks to her legacy. She was equated with Einstein and Picasso and Freud as one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, and has been recognized as such, even if she was forgotten somewhat by that gentleman in her own time. The other thing that I look at in the book is how this woman became an icon, much like Campbell's soup. This is her work, Lamentation, which was really her breakthrough into modernism, actually quite late compared to the Germans. You saw pieces of that during the film. And this is an Andy Warhol lithograph of Lamentation, which says something about what had become of her by the 70s and 80s, which she leveraged quite beautifully, selling the lithographs when her company was in financial trouble. The other thing that Andy Warhol did, which is not as well known, is he did lithographs of her face, which, as you could see from the video, was quite reshaped, shall we say. She is there equated with the likes of Marilyn Monroe and Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who was also one of her friends and edited her, quote, autobiography, which was published after her death. So there was a lot of, shall we say, kind of inside baseball in all of this that goes back to how icons are created and how they use their status as icons. The beginning of the book starts with the premise of Martha Graham standing up and very deeply saying, my work is not political. And I thought, well, okay, and as a dancer, I completely believed that she was not political, not realizing that the reason that the studio had emptied out in 1979 was because her dancers were in Egypt, Israel, and Amman and on the Jimmy Carter Goodwill Tour, coinciding with the Camp David Accords, which I knew little about as a 19-year-old. What I found was traces of her, and it took an awfully long time, but I found traces of her through her FBI files, through testimony of dancers, and through some random files that had been segregated by the State Department archivist and put in Arkansas, that there were tours, and that these tours were literally under every president, Democratic and Republican, Eisenhower through and planned under Bush. She was supposed to go out in November 1989, but a funny thing happened, the wall fell. So that tour, which was pure Americana, was canceled. But it was fairly well known in the field that she was political. Indeed, the Real Ambassadors, which got one performance, an opera by Louis Armstrong and the Grubecks, that has lyrics. And just to stop internal mayhem, we dispatched Martha Graham. That's what we call cultural exchange. No commodity is quite so strange as this thing called cultural exchange. And so I thought that this was wonderful when I found it. What I look at is why and how did modernism and Martha Graham work as something not political. So my dissertation really started out as Martha Graham saying, I am not political, I am not a feminist, I am not a missionary, and I am not a modernist, which was fascinating because there were articles about Martha Graham in the field in the 70s that talked about her as forever modern, historically modern, old-fashioned modernism, all sorts of really interesting terms. So, my first approach was liar, liar, pants on fire. This is not true. And then because of the wonderful advisors who are in this room, I thought, well, why would she say that? Why was this productive to say something like this in the context of the Cold War, in the context of her going to places of mayhem and potential mayhem? And so then it became interesting. What I do is I look at how Martha Graham positioned herself center stage, because she famously said, center stage is wherever I am. Center stage, she was Jocasta on a Noguchi Rock in the story of Oedipus. She was in Joan of Arc. She had a Joan of Arc character. She had an Eve character. She had Medea. She had Clytemnestra. She had Judith. So with all of these women from the Western tradition, what does Martha Graham add in? She adds in the frontier bride. So immediately this female character becomes a part of the tradition, while at the same time she is saying this is universal, which is a huge buzzword right now. But these, in other words, Jocasta is Jocasta not in the playing of it, but in the gut feeling. Medea, it's jealousy, it's angst, it's the lamentation is about grief. The who, the why, the where, all of that is stripped. So that anybody can play this. This is telling an eternal story. And on the frontier, we have the eternal story of the frontier. Interesting, Frederick Jackson Turner spin on things. What she's looking at here is the bride is seeing hope in the world. The husbandman is celebrating his new home and the future. The husbandman is the astronaut looking in space. So she takes this and she reframes it. While at the same time, in many cities, when they do perform Appalachian Spring, it's this Western tradition, it's the guts of love and grief, and then they close with Appalachian Spring. So the period at the end of the sentence is Americana. So tour locations, just so we're, I love maps, so I decided to make this, and I'm sure it's inaccurate. But here it is, these are the early tours, and they're the later tours. And so what we see is that Martha Graham went to every continent with the exception of Africa. Brief Latin America, but we can see the range of her tours of a woman who said, I am not political, my work is not political. The tour locations very much follow the presidential mandates. So 1955-56 under Eisenhower, she goes to the Domino Nations. 1957, she goes to West Berlin, the Cold War hotspot. 1962, under Kennedy, Turkey and Greece, West Germany, then she goes to, quote, behind the Iron Curtain, That's the title given by the dancers. And interestingly, that's one of the things that I really had to piece apart, because Yugoslavia wasn't exactly behind the Iron Curtain, but that's the way the dancers presented it. Indeed, if you go into the Yugoslav reviews and you go into the reviews in Poland, it is dramatically different. And some of the worst reviews she ever got were in Poland. And Yugoslavia seemed to like Appalachian Spring. So it's all it's very interesting. What you'll see here is Israel. There's a constant trope throughout the book that could be a book on its own. And this talks to the coordination between the state and foundations. 1967 and 68 are interesting. Johnson, she goes to Portugal and London. And at first I had, why Portugal and London? This makes no sense. What did Johnson care about Portugal and London? And it wasn't until the book had already been handed into Oxford University Press, bless Oxford University Press, that I found what hadn't happened. By going into an archive with my C-War students with nothing to do, and I said, all right, I'm not going to look for Martha Graham, I'm going to look at the country files. And there it was, the reason that she hadn't been exported to Yugoslavia, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, West Germany, and Austria. They were all planned, and for whatever reason the embassy said no. And that becomes more the story, really, than London and Portugal. She got embassy support in Mexico, but you can see her waning here because there are actually arguments within the State Department about whether or not they gave her $20,000. And what's happening here is she was on what they call the cocktail circuit of diplomacy. So it was trickle-down diplomacy, cocktail circuit of diplomacy, and at this point Martha Graham is a little too adept with her cocktails, for lack of a better way to put it. By 1962, she's falling down on the stage drunk, noted by dancers. She's still piecing herself together, and she's also very old at this point, so it's a very bad combination. Everybody says she needs to retire for whatever reason, and then in 1969, 1970, there's a tour to USSR plan, all sorts of problems, and the alcoholism takes over. And she ends up hospitalized in a coma, and it looks like the company is going to go under. 1974, she has an angel, his name is Francis Mason. He interviewed her Voice of America earlier than 1955 in the 40s. He is kind of watching out for her. He's the one who got her to Yugoslavia under Kennan. He was a cultural attaché there. And he then goes on her board and becomes her board chair and negotiates a tour under Nixon, just as Nixon is opening China, which is very interesting. And actually, what I found was it's really a tour under Kissinger. I have pictures of Martha with Kissinger, buddy, which is really sweet. But what happens is that Graham claims she never went on tour for Nixon. Well, Nixon was vice president under Eisenhower. He saw how it worked in Asia. He's opening China, boom, boom, boom. Nixon resigns, and she goes out on tour a few weeks later. However, lucky for her, Betty Ford had trained with her as a young woman, and it becomes, Martha Graham becomes the first lady of modern dance in the field with a send-off call from Betty Ford. Then in 1979 is the famous Jimmy Carter Goodwill Tour, and this is the first time that Graham goes to Israel, courtesy of the United States government. And I think this chapter is one of my favorite. Really, it's a book in and of itself, but I'm going to leave that to somebody in the room who's younger than I am. Then 1987 was, you can't make this up in my mind, the 750th anniversary of Berlin included Ronald Reagan saying tear down this wall. It also included Martha Graham's company going to East Berlin, where she chose an African-American dancer who did not usually play the role to do the frontier woman. So this again becomes extremely interesting. In 1989, as I said, she was supposed to go to these countries, and she had very cleverly used Nureyev and Baryshnikov where they had used her as well. When they defected, they came to her to learn modern dance. And there's a wonderful moment when Nureyev plays the preacher on the frontier and Baryshnikov plays the husbandman. So you have Baryshnikov walking on stage in awe of the frontier patting his house, and then you have Nureyev coming on stage playing literally freedom of religion. What better than this? And she does other works with them, one of which is American Document, in which she has Baryshnikov reciting words from American documents such as the Declaration of Independence and others. And she writes to Barbara Bush that she's going to take a film of Baryshnikov performing this Americana modern dance and play it in Russia and St. Petersburg. I think this says something very wise about President Bush that this was pulled back. The program was Americana that she was going to take out, and people say, well, we didn't know the wall was going to fall. Well, we didn't know the wall was going to fall, but there were certainly percolating youth movements in the countries that were on Bush's radar screen. So how did we get to, how did we get to Bush? I finished the book, I finished the dissertation. I figured out that when Martha Graham went to the embassy in 1962 in Yugoslavia, she was supposed to meet George Kennan, and I went to the Kennan archives and found out that Kennan had the flu. And a very wise advisor said, if you know that Kennan had the flu when he was supposed to meet Martha Graham, you need to stop and start writing. So I did, and I finished the dissertation. When I was Googling around to do a presentation, Martha Graham always told her dancers that they had to wear white gloves. I couldn't find a picture of Martha Graham with white gloves, so thanks to Google, I was Googling and Googling black gloves, no white gloves. And there was a picture of Martha Graham with Barbara Bush playing with the puppies, like little schoolgirls. Oh, this is the strangest thing I've ever seen. Getty Images wanted $350 for the image. No. If Getty Image has it, the Bush Library must have it. So I contacted the Bush Library, and there was this whole stream. And I thought, well, if they've got pictures, they must have documents. And indeed, there were letters between Barbara Bush and Graham, and it got quite convoluted. So there were many ins and outs. And I have to thank Oxford because I kept resubmitting the manuscript and no one said anything. So I had to just let it go. So there are many strains. Race goes through this. The CIA runs through this Congress for Cultural Freedom. I am fairly convinced that Eisenhower put cameras on the bottom of one of her planes. She went with 2 planes. Indonesia, CIA documents have a landing pattern for Indonesia, which during 1955 Bandung Conference. So there are all of these strains that work together. And I look forward to hearing comments and criticisms. I will end there. The only thing that I like to end with is with Martha Graham saying, I'm not modern, I am contemporary. Indeed, when her tour was being scouted in 1989, the woman who scouted the tour for her said to me at a cocktail party, she said, there was this tour I scouted. And she said, it was 1989, and I said, Martha, Linda, why didn't you tell me about this? And she said, well, because it never happened. I didn't think you'd be interested. Again, history is about what didn't happen so much. And her daughter, Martha Hodes, who's a very prestigious historian named for Martha Graham, was standing. I said, Martha, can I use this? She said, and then Linda said, and it was funny because in Moscow there was this man, and he was there too, and he was an American, and he was scouting golf courses, I think. So I have a research assistant who was very good with these issues, Timotin, and we did a little background. And I actually went to the public documents, and indeed, Martha crossed paths with our new president. Martha said, I'm not modern, I'm contemporary. And the person I really have to thank for all of this is Martha. Anyway, thank you.
I can't remember, and I was trying to today, when Victoria first appeared in my dance history survey course. But one day there she was. She wasn't your usual undergraduate. She was older. She had 2 masters, maybe she had more, but that's what I thought at the time. And she had at least 2 careers behind her. She knew quite a bit about Baroque dance and a little bit about a lot of other dance forms. But what I remember best was her passion for Martha Graham. Victoria had studied at the Graham studio for many years. She was adept at Graham's technique, as we've heard, and familiar with her dances. And she knew many of the people who had performed those dances because they had been her teachers. Unsurprisingly, when Victoria began writing papers, they were nearly always on some aspect of the history of what might be termed the Graham enterprise. Very surprisingly, they revealed their writer to be a glutton for archives. You've seen the pages and pages that have been shown to you. So you see, I'm not exaggerating. There seemed to be no collection Victoria was willing to ignore, no set of papers that didn't contain some nugget of wisdom, no former dancer who didn't have a story she wanted to hear. This tireless pursuit of Graham's multifaceted history, coupled with Victoria's deep interest in international diplomacy, resulted in the book whose publication we celebrate today, Martha Graham's Cold War, The Dance of American Diplomacy. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about tours. The Martha Graham Company, as we saw, undertook many tours during the Cold War that served U.S. political and diplomatic ends. And for what those ends all were, you have to read the book. Until it became too expensive, touring was a way of life for dance and theater groups going back to the 19th century, and of course even before. Denishon, where Graham received her earliest professional experience in the late 1910s and 20s, made long, grueling tours. So too did Anna Pavlova's ballet company, which crisscrossed the United States several times before the ballerina died in 1931 on yet another tour, not of the US, but somewhere else, and the Ballet Russe companies of the 1930s and 1940s, which often spent 5 months on the road, wedged between seasons in New York and a few other cities. And the same was pretty much true of the company known today as American Ballet Theater. After World War II, international touring resumed, but for the most part, these were commercial arrangements, although some tours certainly had a political dimension, if not necessarily a Cold War one. And I'm thinking here of the often imperialist discourse of Britain's Sadler's Wells Company from the late 1940s and early 50s. Stalin's death in 1953 marked the real beginning of the Cold War ballet tours. In 1954, a group of Soviet dancers from the Bolshoi and Kirov companies arrived in Paris for a gala season at the Opéra. Scheduled to open after what turned out to be the humiliating French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the tour was canceled and the dancers sent home. 2 years later, the Bolshoi, led by Galina Ulanova, took London by storm. And in 1959, with Maya Plisetskaya at its head, the company triumphed in New York. Most of the companies involved in this high-stakes cultural exchange were the big national companies, state-sponsored and state-supported, such as the Paris Opera Ballet, Royal Ballet, Bolshoi Ballet, and Kirov Ballet, today's Mariinsky Company, although the USSR's Moiseyev folk dance ensemble was also a hot international ticket. Some of these companies were very old, although the Royal and the Moiseyev had their origins in the 1920s. A very different situation prevailed in the US. Here, the history of dance is bound up with popular entertainment. I mean, this is true everywhere, but especially so in the US. In the early 20th century, Isadora Duncan and Ruth St. Denis, people who figure in Victoria's account, were among the first to create self-consciously artistic forms of dance expression and to perform them or attempt to perform them in spaces distinct from popular entertainment. By the 1930s, multiple dance practices had emerged, some oriented toward what had become known as the modern dance, others toward ballet. These practices were far from uniform. The infusion of funds from federal recovery programs, the expansion of dance training and performance opportunities in colleges and universities, the expansion of dance training and the popularity of the touring ballet Russe companies contributed to a huge explosion of American art dance. The US companies that figured preeminently in the early government-sponsored Cold War tours, American Ballet Theater, New York City Ballet, Martha Graham's company, the José Limón company, all had their origins in the 1930s. Others, including the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, the Joffrey Ballet, Merce Cunningham Company, Paul Taylor Company, Jerome Robbins, Ballets USA, had their origins in the 1950s. Regardless of their technical and artistic orientation, American companies differed from their European counterparts in several important respects. All were unfunded or very minimally funded by the federal government. Obviously, by the 1970s, this changes somewhat. Even the New York City Ballet, probably the most economically viable of these companies, spent long periods on the road trying to make payroll. Dancers taught at colleges and universities, worked at community centers, danced on Broadway, choreographed Hanukkah festivals, hoped for commissions from Juilliard and the American Dance Festival, and signed up for unemployment. Moreover, dance exports were far more artistically diverse. American dance exports were far more artistically diverse than the European ones. Several companies represented modern dance, a capacious category that embraced work by choreographers as diverse as Graham, Limón, Alvin Ailey, Paul Taylor, and Merce Cunningham. The ballet offerings were equally diverse, with American Ballet Theater being the only company to include 19th century ballets in its repertory. Finally, compared to the Cold War offerings of Russian or European ensembles, a majority of the American works performed abroad were recent in genesis and contemporary in inspiration, albeit in different ways. Yet for all that she shared with her cohort, Martha Graham stands apart. A point that Victoria makes is that Graham's company was racially and ethnically diverse. She also mentioned that just before. Beginning in the 1940s, Graham had both African American and Asian American dancers, and this continued across generations. Her casting was multiracial, regardless of subject. Given the relatively small size of her company, this was all the more remarkable. Arthur Mitchell's presence on the New York City Ballet roster from the mid-1950s to the late 1960s certainly constituted a racial breakthrough. But a second African-American dancer did not join the company until Mitchell had left to form the Dance Theater of Harlem. Secondly, Graham was the only woman in her Cold War cohort to head a choreographer-led company. Balanchine, Ailey, Robbins, Taylor, Joffrey, Cunningham, and Limón were all men. We're talking about a gang of guys. Although Graham never identified herself as a feminist, her art was female-centered, her technique originated in the female body, and her stories retold myths from a female perspective. As Victoria shows, Graham received support over the years from women philanthropists and political figures such as Eleanor Roosevelt, Lila Atchison Wallace, Bessabé de Rothschild, the Lewison sisters, Eleanor Dulles, and many others. You'll have to read her book. Finally, compared to the large ballet companies that received the lion's share of Cold War government dollars, Graham's company was almost intimate in scale and personal in its approach to storytelling, even when those stories had their source in myth. Victoria's work demonstrates, I think, that dance, often said to be the most ephemeral of the arts, leaves numerous material traces. To be sure, not all these traces are archival, and not all are written on paper. Many take the form of oral histories, recordings, photographs, artworks, revivals, and memorabilia of all kinds. But together, they map multiple histories and enable us to recuperate, if only through an act of memory, artists and performances otherwise lost in time. So thank you, Victoria.
So I have two brief comments before I begin. One is just a word of thanks to the organizers for having me here today, and another is a word of apology for the state of my voice, which seems to have deserted me at a rather inopportune moment. But I will, in the spirit of Martha Graham, soldier on, and I beg your patience if it goes out. My most hearty thanks, though, go to Victoria Phillips for producing such a rich and interesting text. As Phillips points out in her introduction, dance, whether because of its supposed ephemerality, its femininity, its associations with the profane body rather than the elevated mind, has too often been relegated to the margins of scholarly analysis. This is thankfully not the case everywhere, and especially not at Columbia, thanks in large part to the efforts of the august Lynn Garafola, sitting here next to me. And as someone who works on dance myself, though I'm primarily a historian of science and technology, it's particularly exciting to see further evidence of the growing strength of dance scholarship. As such, while it's no longer news that the United States government engaged in an ongoing concerted program of cultural diplomacy throughout the Cold War, employing visual artists, architects, musicians, and writers of all stripes, and as I'll point out later, also scientists, relatively less attention has been focused on dance. Phillips' book, therefore, represents a welcome addition to the intellectual canon and will spark, I think, conversation with earlier entries into the field, including Naima Previtz's Dance for Export, Claire Croft's Dancers as Diplomats, as well as, if somewhat more orthogonally, Adria Mata's excellent Aloha America. Much of the existing scholarship has sought to illuminate the workings of cultural diplomacy on a macro level, looking at the historical interactions between a wide variety of artists, funding bodies, and government officials. Phillips, however, takes a different approach, directing her attention to a single figure, Martha Graham, across more than 4 decades, at least 8 presidential administrations, and countless countries. This decision has produced a book that is remarkably rich and detailed, fueled by Phillips' exhaustive archival research. As a result, the reader begins to get a real sense of what it meant to be Graham or one of her company members on a day-to-day basis. Phillips' attention to global politics is also thus complemented by her ability to illuminate deeply local ones, the world of bureaucratic wrangling, personal alliances, and the varied vocabulary of the presidential brush-off. This kind of work is enormously time-consuming and difficult, and the book is undoubtedly the most comprehensive account of Graham's diplomatic work and will be a crucial resource for future scholars. For Phillips, it seems this granularity is also kind of an argument in and of itself, an assertion that a female figure like Graham, operating in the quote-unquote cultural sphere, deserves the same kind of detailed biographic treatment lavished on better-known, generally male, traditionally political Cold Warriors. In practice, one of the ways in which this attention to detail pays off is in Phillips' ability to illuminate the many levels on which Graham's tours served the ends of the United States. On the surface, of course, was what her work was meant to symbolize, a universal, apolitical modernity fomented in the US but available to all. As her research demonstrates, however, the transmission of this message was not always successful. In country after country, both critical and audience reactions to Graham's performances were profoundly mixed. Though sympathetic press reports and diplomatic cables may have suggested otherwise, there were precious few instances in which Graham was an unqualified hit. At various times and places, she was found to be too strange, too capitalist, too derivative, too elite, too old-fashioned, and simply too old. In Singapore in 1955, 2/3 of the audience walked out during the first intermission. In Berlin in 1957, she received tepid applause before being upstaged by Mary Wigman, thought by many to be a relic of the Nazi past. Others, like audiences in the Philippines, saw pieces like Frontier or Appalachian Spring not as a symbol of anti-colonial rebellion against the British, but as an embodiment of the U.S.'s appropriation of the land of Native peoples. There were absolutely audiences that did appreciate Graham and her oeuvre, but Phillips argues that her role as cultural diplomat went far beyond the stage, as she seemed to excel at press junkets, dinners, and one-on-one meetings. Phillips also provides ample evidence, though this is not her focus, for a far more cynical view of the government's interest in Graham's continued touring. As she suggested, with surveillance equipment attached to the company's planes, strange men who joined the tour to just hand out dancers plane tickets, and performance receptions as in Ankara in 1962 or around 1955 that primarily served as cover for covert diplomatic meetings or elite networking. The exercise of quote-unquote soft and hard power were materially intertwined. As reported by Graham's company manager after the performance in Tehran, quote, "The U.S. ambassador announced that as far as he is concerned, if the theater burned down and Martha never performed, a tremendous thing had been accomplished." In this, Graham's work mirrored the diplomatic efforts of a number of American scientists sent overseas during the period, ostensibly charged with using science's quote-unquote universal modernity to forge cross-border cultural bonds, but whose true purposes often included various forms of intelligence gathering. Phillips does an incredibly thorough job of sketching the motivations of the officials, funders, and bureaucrats who ultimately sponsored the tours. Any good book, though, I think inevitably leaves one wanting more. And at the conclusion of this one, my curiosity about Graham's own thought process was only further piqued. Much as in the striking image that adorns the book's cover, Graham herself remains somewhat of a cipher, which I suspect may in part have been a result of limitations in the archival record. Was she, in fact, a true believer in the cause of cultural diplomacy, or simply a very canny businesswoman eager to accept funding that would keep her work and her company afloat and in the news? How did she ultimately measure her own success or failure? I was also intrigued by the possibility that at least some of Graham's choreographic decisions were explicitly made with government aims in mind. For me, the book also provoked broader questions about how exactly we might go about measuring the efficacy of something like cultural diplomacy. What would it mean to turn hearts and minds, and how would we as historians know if it worked? Phillips provides striking evidence of varied individuals and groups responding positively to Graham in public, standing ovations from imperial officials, Buddhist monks laughing in apparent delight, Uday Shankar greeting Graham at the airport with a bouquet of flowers. In evaluating these interactions, however, it may be worth further contemplating the fact that Graham's audiences were performers as well, with their own aims, goals, and strategies, and that their public reactions may have not matched their private thoughts. With all this complexity, the ultimate effects of Graham's diplomatic efforts may be difficult to evaluate. This, however, I don't think diminishes the usefulness or force of Phillips' works. One of the central methodological insights of my own field is that the precept that the study of scientific quote-unquote failures is no less important than that of the corresponding successes. And in fact, that the failures, if studied with care in all of their specificity and particularity, can often tell us more about the past than their counterparts. I think that's certainly the case here. Martha Graham's Cold War paints a rich portrait of a complicated period, and I think will open up many new questions for future scholars. And I thank you again, Victoria, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Richard.
A wise historian once remarked to me that stimulating books bring together two topics that are typically considered in isolation. Victoria Phillips's rich and revealing Martha Graham's Cold War fits the bill. We know much about Cold War diplomacy and a fair amount about American dance. Phillips brings these two topics together in a compelling narrative that reaches new conclusions about the relationship between artistic creativity, diplomacy, and what Phillips calls cultural convergences. That is, the syncretic infusion by a diplomatic actor of host country elements into an art form to achieve a political goal. For the dances were often staged with specific reference to the countries in which they were being performed. For as Phillips convincingly demonstrates, the history of American dance was, as the career of Martha Graham compellingly reveals, was an effective means of promoting American freedom and democracy abroad. And I do take that to be a central theme of the book. Dance, Phillips explains, was valued by U.S. diplomats as second in value only to music, as a necessarily apolitical agent in both aligned and non-aligned nations. And what we mean by apolitical is a theme of the book. The movement of the body had a universality that, like music, could be readily appreciated in parts of the world that lacked direct familiarity with American literature, political ideals, or English language. Phillips describes her book as a very political biography. Indeed, in her introduction, she goes so far as to proclaim, and here I'm quoting, it's a political, old-fashioned, big woman's Cold War biography. This is a bold assertion, since, as Phillips explains, Graham repeatedly denied that she was in fact a political actor. For Phillips, Graham's denial is compelling evidence that Graham was in fact a female diplomat exercising what would come after her day to be known as soft power. I guess the end of her day, maybe. 80s. As Phillips puts it, and here I'm a long block quote, Graham's public denial of her political work as a modern artist for the United States is a direct signal of Cold War politics in action. Like the export of abstract visual art, her choreography and persona met the U.S. government's anti-Soviet informational or propaganda needs precisely because her work could be promoted as modernist, a free form disallowed by artists in the Soviet Union that was independently created and that was apolitical. That's a part of the fascination of the book, the mingling of the political and the apolitical. The Cold War, we now know, was much more than merely a bipolar contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. Martha Graham's Cold War underscores the multipolarity of cultural diplomacy of the period. Though Graham's dance troupe never made it to the Soviet Union, at least I don't think they did, a planned 1989 tour is called off at the last minute, a victim of the rapidly evolving international situation, never made it to the Soviet Union. It performed in over a dozen or maybe 24 countries: Japan, Indonesia, Israel, India, Iran, Poland, Finland, West Germany. The dances she choreographed often incorporated host country elements. Biblical narrative in Israel, religious themes in Poland, Catholic themes in particular, East Asian stage design in Japan. Modern dance for Graham combined three elements: sexuality, religiosity, nationality. The sexuality of Graham's choreography helped her to displace the staid body, her phrase, the staid body characteristic of European and Russian ballet with the, quote, highly trained, riveting pelvis of the modern woman, unquote, adding, and here I quote, a new archetype to the Western dance canon, unquote. For Graham, the sexually explicit physicality of deep pelvic contractions and releases, which she calls the sexually based center of her technique, which literally put on center stage two of the most elemental aspects of human life, namely breathing and the orgasm. This enabled her to address the problems of humankind, I'm quoting, in a resonating woman-centered voice, unquote. By transforming eroticism into an art form, she advanced one of the primary goals of aesthetic modernism, that is, the creation of a universal genre that championed political freedom without advancing a specific political agenda. It was an ingenious strategy and enabled Graham to appeal across the political spectrum to political figures as otherwise diverse as Harry Truman, George Kennan, Henry Kissinger. While the sexual physicality of Graham's choreography set it apart from Soviet ballet, which remained wedded to 19th century high culture motifs, the aristocratic Swan Lake long remained a Moscow ballet staple. The sexual physicality was by no means its only distinctive element. The frank embrace of religiosity is another feature that set Graham's performances apart from their Soviet counterparts. Graham was descended on her mother's side from some of the earliest Protestant settlers in North America. Her Mayflower ancestry was prominently featured in dance company promotional literature, and I mentioned in the book, I think, at least a half dozen times. And she frequently drew on religious themes in her choreography, implicitly contrasting the God-fearing United States, a theme much emphasized by Eisenhower-era cultural diplomacy, especially in Eastern Europe, contrasting the God-fearing United States with the godless Soviet Union. Modernity American style was in this way emphatically not secular, a circumstance that is sometimes overlooked in historical writing on U.S. Cold War cultural diplomacy, yet one that was unmistakably present in the artistic decisions that Graham made in staging performances in Israel, in Poland, and in Japan. Now, the third theme. And this theme, in addition to sexuality and religiosity, is American nationality. One of Graham's most oft-performed dances was Appalachian Spring, a celebration of the American frontier spirit, music by composer Aaron Copland, that featured archetypal Americans, including a wandering preacher, presumably modeled on a Methodist circuit rider. Graham was familiar with the frontier thesis of the Harvard historian Frederick Jackson Turner, Phillips speculates, and she conceived of modern dance as a way to take down barriers, walls of the mind, as Phillips puts it, that impeded the movement of people and ideas. Though the land frontier had closed in the United States by 1890, as Turner famously stated, the promise of new beginnings remained a cornerstone of the American spirit and of her choreography. The 1961 edition of his famous economics textbook, MIT economist Paul Samuelson confidently predicted that the Soviet Union's economy was growing so much faster than the U.S. economy that Soviet GNP would exceed that of the United States as soon as 1984. The Soviet economy, Samuelson famously wrote, quote, is proof that, contrary to what many skeptics had earlier believed, a Soviet command economy can function and even thrive. Unquote. Graham's dance company toured at a time in which the superiority of the United States over the Soviet Union, a superiority that, as I read this book, Graham emphatically endorsed, superiority could not be measured in material terms. Instead, the superiority of the United States lay in the power of its ideals of freedom, truth, and democracy. It's a quotation. And perhaps above all, in its openness to the world. Well, we are no longer living in Martha Graham's world. And it's to Phillips' great credit that she has so compellingly reconstructed a chapter in the history of U.S. cultural diplomacy in which the United States government, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly, championed universalistic values in a bid to win the hearts and minds of what insiders referred to as the non-aligned world. Graham appealed to an imagined community, Phillips' phrase, an imagined community of cultural sophisticates. Her audience was not the many, but the few, and even the few didn't always quite understand what was going on. Yet Graham never wavered in her conviction that freedom, which Eric Foner, Phillips goes out, has astutely called the single most important in American identity, both as individuals and as a nation, that freedom was available only in a democracy. In the age of Trump, this appeal has ceased to define U.S. cultural diplomacy, at least as far as I can determine. It may well be time to reconsider its history. For alongside the well-documented U.S. foreign policy disasters of the post-Second World War era, the Bay of Pigs, Vietnam, 2003 Iraq War, there were notable triumphs. American diplomats once knew not only how to browbeat, but also to dance. Phillips' fine book provides us with a record of their performance, a performance in which modern art could be redemptive and even liberatory, a legacy of the 18th century Enlightenment that, following the disaster of 2 world wars, helped to recast Western civilization in a distinctly American idiom. Graham always denied that she was a propagandist, that she was a modernist, that she was a missionary, and even that she was a feminist. Yet the historical record, as I read Phillips' fine book, points in a different direction. Modern dance, and this I take to be an implicit kind of argument or provocation of the book, modern dance is born neither in Germany nor in Russia, but in the United States, with Graham as a potent Cold War propagandist, Phillips' phrase, who helped to persuade opinion leaders around the world that the United States was not merely like the Soviet Union an economic powerhouse, but it was also a progenitor of cultural forms that spoke to a yearning for a universal soul of mankind. Thank you.
Thank all 3 of you. Thank you, Victoria, for having pretext and subject here. Would you like to say something, or should we open it up to the public? I think that would get some
Do you want me to respond, or do you want to open it up?
I think we should open it up. Okay. Hear some, more questions, accolades, and then we can, turn around to and speak more. Questions? Yes, please. Yes.
Is there a mic? Yeah.
I was taken by a story I heard at the beginning of a Martha Graham performance, and I was wondering if you could speak about the origins of Panorama, which is before this, because she was so political, even before Nazi Germany got started at the very beginning. So could you mention what you think about that?
I think this is a really interesting subject, and it was actually my master's thesis fed into this idea of the interwar political dance, which I argue really seeded Moscow, and the agitprop information that was coming out of Moscow seeded many modern dances. And Graham was certainly a fellow traveler. She, like many of us, would have believed in housing and also in nets for people. She was choreographing protest dances, and actually also worked for the democratically elected communist movement in the Spanish Civil War. Interestingly, in the Spanish Civil War performances and fundraisers, she performed Frontier. So it was always this center of believing in freedom and democracy. That was the core of this. What I found particularly interesting, knowing this about her, I really studied the card-carrying communists. Interested me much more than the fellow travelers in dance. Graham came into their world. She was considered the bourgeois by the daily worker, and then she tried to reform herself a bit. What becomes extremely important to me is that when I ordered her FBI file in every possible iteration of her name, married, unmarried, spellings, and they finally said, stop, we've sent it to you. Martha Graham's life begins in 1974. It is cleaned up. And how it's cleaned up and why it's cleaned up, I don't know. But at the National Security Archive, which is a wonderful private archive out of the George Washington University, somebody else had ordered it many, many years ago, and there were 2 pages about the Spanish Civil War and her activities there that had somehow at some point been eliminated. And so that is what is extremely fascinating to me. Isadora Duncan is known as the mother of modern dance. Yes, she doesn't use the pelvis, she uses the breath, and she famously wrote, I See America Dancing. Well, Isadora Duncan also said, "I am red," and was, choreographed many, many pro-Soviet works in Russia. She performed for Lenin. So, this whole reconfiguration of modern dance as free and American is fascinating. There was a woman who wrote in the late 1940s, and she wrote something called the Borzoi Book of Modern Dance, which defined the modern dance. And under New Dance Group, which was a communist, at one point communist allied group, she wrote, "There are no reds in dance anymore," 1949, let's say. And what she wrote was, Mary Wigman cannot have done modern dance, and the Japanese cannot really have done modern dance because modern dance is free, and those countries are not free, and therefore modern dance is American, and that was what was taken forward. It's, in my opinion, doesn't happen to be true. And then, of course, it becomes very upsetting in Germany in 1957 when Mary Wigman is told to, people are told to refer to Mary Wigman in the past tense because she choreographed for the Nazi 1936 Olympics and got rid of her Jewish dancers and was very much allied with the Nazis. We were told, she is dead artistically, and then in 1957 in Berlin, Martha Graham performs. She largely does not do well. Martha Graham goes to a Mary Wigman performance of Rite of Spring, which triumphs. So all of this becomes very, very interesting. But Martha Graham did do the protest works, and they were very important if overlooked.
Yes.
Thank you all for this illuminating discussion. I have one comment and then one question. Oh, thank you all. I have one comment and one question. The comment is just that no artist likes to be defined. So it's not surprising to me at all that Martha Graham would say, "I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm the other thing," because she just wanted to be herself as an artist. The question is about the McCarthy era and how that was such a big thing in the Cold War, and a lot of her dancers were leftist, Anna Sokolow, Jane Dudley. How did that, and the McCarthy era was so threatening to so many people in the performing arts. How did that affect her status as a pro-American and the tours, and how she handled the dancers in her company?
Another really fascinating question. By the time she was doing tours, Anna Sokolow had her own company and was not performing with Graham. Jane Dudley, I believe, was either not performing with the company or she was in London. I'm not sure of the timing of that. Other dancers had their own companies. Some of them were not allowed on the Ed Sullivan Show. The only dancer who had leftist ties was really Pearl Lang, and she didn't tour. Whether she didn't tour because she didn't want to tour or didn't, I'm not clear on that, and Pearl would never talk about it. But what does become hugely fascinating is that Donald McHale, who was a male African-American, Caribbean-American dancer who was allied with the New Dance Group and some communist works. He had choreographed his own kind of, certainly, I don't know, leftist works. He was taken on tour. And there was a lot of dissent in the company when she took certain dancers in on the 1955-56 tour who were African American and had not studied at the school as rigorously as some others. She took a Filipino dancer to the Philippines. We Are Like You, cultural convergences, and as they're traveling through India and some of the other countries that are accusing the United States, and rightly so, of being a racist nation, she's bringing an integrated company. That was a very important message. One of the things that Linda Hodes told me was that when in the plane with the dancers, that they traveled with a tennis team, and the tennis team in the 1950s was integrated. Fascinating. So what we're exporting abroad is not what's happening at home necessarily, and this becomes really interesting with Graham and her relationship to Aaron Copland. So 1955, 1956, Appalachian Spring is going out at the same time as Congress is saying we will not do Lincoln Suite for the inauguration of Eisenhower because Copeland's a communist. Okay, interesting. So what play? I think we have to look what played in architecture, what played in dance, in the foreign market. It wasn't that easy to get on a plane. That's one of the things that the dancers talk about is, this was several planes to get to Japan, right? It wasn't, so congressmen didn't necessarily travel. She really, she sidestepped the McCarthy era, maybe because she didn't do that many works that were overtly political. Appalachian Spring, Frontier, her alliance with the Roosevelt White House in 1937 with Eleanor Roosevelt. There were many reasons. She never took government funding from Roosevelt for the Works Progress Administration, which was it was shut down, and people were accused of being communists there. So she really skirted a lot of the things that would have put her under attack. But what does become interesting, and this goes back to Richard's discussions of sexuality, is she performed a work or choreographed a work called Phaedra, and this is so the Congress has a House Un-American Activities Committee, I'm not getting the name right, on the Cold War, and accuses Graham of being overtly sexual, and that this nonsense should be shut down. Why is the government funding this sexual smut? And it's the story of Phaedra. Now, it was highly sexual, and Graham was doing her all in the 1960s to make herself relevant, and one of the ways was this very sexual work. On the other hand, but then you have the intelligentsia saying, well, don't you know the myth of Phaedra? And apparently the congressmen had gone to Bonn or Germany, and there was argument about whether they had really been in which city, but they walked out in the middle. So the accusation was, well, they don't even know the end of the myth, right? And that there's a huge dialogue, fights about this. Mary Vigmont comes forward and says, what United States is this that censors its artists? So you have this real battle between Congress, the domestic body, and what the State Department is looking for.
Could I just add a little something to this about the, many people were part of this much larger, you might say, left-wing community that flourished in the 1930s, the 1940s, and then there were those who actually joined the Communist Party. And those are the ones who really run into trouble during the 1950s. There's also something else that really shocked me when I first started looking through Red Channels, which was the blacklisters' Bible. And that is how few dancers were on it. And then I kind of realized that most dancers were under the radar. They were not sufficiently part of what you might call an economy that they could be gotten at. They weren't on television really. They weren't on Broadway, so they weren't in movies. If they perhaps were teaching in the public schools, they could be punished in some way. Who cares if you're working for group theater or if you're working for in a community center in Forest Hills? There were a lot of ways in which you could remain outside the official purview. Even, of course, working on Broadway was fine because most of the producers, they had relatives who were members of the party. Certain people were certainly never traveled under any kind of government auspices, like Helen Ramirez, for instance. Although I don't think at that point she actually had the kind of resources to muster a company to go abroad. But I do think that there's something else about dancers being under the under the radar.
And I think a fascinating study would be Jerome Robbins, because he was very much allied to the Communist Party, and I think one could go into the Tenement archives and find him before the CPUSA archives were even processed. I could find him at some of those tenement camps. And then
That was
way before,
Yes.
but then he's asked to testify in front of HUAC, and he names names. And one of the names he named was one of the founders of the New Dance Group, who everybody knew about and had been named in red channels. And but then after naming names and Fancy Free and all the rest, he goes on tour. So I think there's also something that's very powerful about the redemption of the leftist.
Over there?
He officially became a fugitive.
Yep.
No.
I have a question. How did Martha Graham continue or further the U.S. and U.S. government's depiction of women during the Cold War? And how did this change during second wave feminism and the women's rights movement?
This gets into the whole feminist aspect of things. Martha Graham wanted to, very much be known as a human, but yet she certainly used her feminine wiles while at meetings. It's a very complicated issue and question. I was the first talk I was asked to give was at the Women's Salon at the New York Historical Society, and I know from documents Martha Graham would have groaned. She hated women's events. We see pictures of her leaning down and kneeling at a hibachi grill, and letters about this is why do I have to, or not letters from her but letters from the State Department. She doesn't like doing this, but we'll get her to do it. What she really loved was chatting up the male, or what seems to me was chatting with the male powerful diplomats. My sense is her letters are not available. When she passed away, her archives went to someone who sold them to the Library of Congress with the idea that he would need permission, and then he never gave anybody permission. Then there was a legal case, and the librarian of the advanced archivist opened up the foundation papers. So the only way we can see Martha Graham, or I found that one can see Martha Graham's thoughts, is early on she was in therapy with Francis Wicks, who was a Jungian, and there are letters between Wicks and between Graham and Wicks. So you get Graham's letters by reading Wicks' papers at the Library of Congress. So that's why we don't have that end as much. But I think I think her saying, I'm not a liberationist, I am not a feminist, very much goes back to this idea of humanism and her deep desire not to be associated with any group. And I think this, it's fascinating to me because Georgia O'Keeffe says the same thing and takes the same posture. Eleanor Dulles, exactly the same thing, the same posture. So I think there's an entire study that can be done of these women who were extremely powerful and trailblazers in their times who said, I'm not a feminist, I'm not going to ally with that movement.
Oh, would you like to make a couple of last comments, and then we... I'm sorry.
Oh, question.
Anna.
Yes, but I see you. Yes, thank you. Excuse me.
I will identify myself. I was the chief critic, dance critic of the New York Times, and I interviewed, I'm a great admirer of Flores. However, I have read the book. And I have to say a few things. You've been throwing around a lot of labels. You don't have to be a communist to have been against Franco. I never heard of what you call the democratically elected communist government of Spain as being communist. There were communists of all stripes in the Spanish Civil War, but I don't think you should define it as you just did. She definitely did a piece about the Spanish Civil War, so did Jerome Robbins, who was part of a communist group, and so did Ruth Page, who was not a communist, and many pieces were done. about the Spanish Civil War. It was a highly traumatic event, and of course Picasso was a communist, but the thing that the Museum of Modern Art prided itself on for many years was its big mural after the Germans bombed Guernica, a town in Spain, during the Spanish Civil War. My field is the popular front, and although I am a dance critic, but I haven't lived life here at Columbia, and I do know the 30s very well. And I think that when she said, "I'm not political," you know Victoria, but that she really meant she was not part of the new dance group and all those people that you have been very involved with, and you know that material. She meant she was not sectarian, and I know she told me that when they were performing in Pittsburgh, her all-female group insisted that they cancel the performance so they could run back to Union Square and be part of a communist demonstration. She was not part of that. She was not a fellow traveler. I would like to define her in the following way. When I interviewed her, I said, "What do you think was the," well, I interviewed her many, many times, but in an early interview, she said something that has been quoted many times, that in 1923, after she left the Dennis Shawn group, she went to the Art Institute of Chicago, and she saw a painting by Kandinsky. She had never spoken about that until I asked her, and she said, "I saw a splash of red against a field of blue, and I will dance like that." That is not political in the sectarian sense. That's who she was. And I don't see that you've said anything positive about her as an artist. No, not today. No.
Okay.
I'm just saying you see her as a wily feminist, wily operator. I think she hated having to plead for money and go on those government tours. She wanted traveling, yes, I agree. But there's another thing I want to say. You have to go back into context. No one called modern dance in the 20s or 30s. That was a term that was coined by journalists, especially John Martin. She told me everything is modern when you are in a period that is modern with you. And I really think that one has to remember, where were we? Most of us were not, including me, believe it or not. Where were all these people writing about dance in the 20s and 30s? And I don't think that the labels we use now, and I know who Rosalind Krakow, I was on the Times, and Carol Schoenberg was the music critic of the Times. That was his wife, the book that you refer to. I think that you have to really, if you're talking to a partially lay audience in terms of dance, not history, political science, etc., you have to go back into what the situation was when modern dance, so-called, started in this country. I'm sorry to sound like this, but I really feel. Also, I have a question for Professor John. Was Frederick Jackson Turner at Harvard or Wisconsin?
He was first at Wisconsin, then at Harvard.
Well, I see him as somebody who impressed me when he was at Wisconsin. So, thank you.
Okay, yeah, he was at Harvard for many years.
Thank you. Thank you. Hey, you want-
Thank you so much, Anne. As always, you have wonderful comments, and I would like to correct anyone's view that I do not deeply respect Martha Graham. As a matter of fact, the book ends, and I will give you a copy at the end so you can see. The book ends with Pearl Lang telling me, "Never forget, Martha is a genius." And the point of the book, and I'm sorry I haven't made that clear enough, is that the reason that she was so valuable was she was a genius. Her work was genius, she was genius. And that was very well recognized by the State Department. Carol Gluck, who unfortunately can't be here, she said these works were like a smorgasbord, right? So they were not made for the government, but what they presented was extreme opportunity. I quote Martha Graham saying, "I'm not political" in India, 1955, 1956, while on a State Department tour. So that's where I'm not referring back to her talking about her political self in any other time. So that to me is what's interesting, that you would be on that tour saying that. It was recorded in the press and also in an interview with Ethel Winter and Charlie. So that's where I'm getting that. So I would beg to differ there. I think the whole her relationship with the state is fascinating. Linda Hodes tells me that she was tickled pink to go to Washington and used to skip rehearsals and say, "Oh, I can't come. Washington called." This was a refrain that Linda remembers. And she, when I found pictures of her with Kissinger and Reagan and Barbara Bush and Eleanor Dulles, she was having maybe she was a good actress, but in my read, she was having the time of her life. And I think what I can do is, rather than just go into the pictures in the book, one can go back and look at the clicks, kind of the big sheets that show them in movement. Yes, did the government use her? Absolutely. Did she use the government? Absolutely. So I think it was mutually beneficial to everyone. So I mean that's where I come out on this. I don't condemn anyone. I think there are true ethical problems that bring us to today, which is, when do you take state money and when do you not take state money? And this was something that one has to look at. I think that Graham was perfectly aligned with her belief in democracy and freedom.
I just want to say we don't take state money. That is the problem. We are not in a state-subsidized arts community in this country, unlike France and at one time England and Germany. So the point is, I think you can't accuse her of taking state money.
I'm not accusing her of doing anything. I'm saying that she cashed checks from the State Department. I mean, that's it. She paid dancers with State Department money, and that was extremely useful. The other thing that I think is fascinating is that Graham, the Kandinsky painting is a perfect example of Graham at her best. Yes, she said, it's now lore after your interview. Someday I will make a dance like that. And then she makes Diversion of Angels, which is a very important piece. And to this day, if you go back to the Chicago Museum, that painting wasn't there. So I've done this work because I wanted to know which painting it was. No, she obviously saw a Kandinsky painting. Clearly, if you see Diversion of Angels, but Martha Graham loves the drama and Holston and Studio 54 and I mean that's.
Why are you talking like that? This is not the Graham.
May I just say
Yeah,
something?
yes.
I would like to just address the student. I think you were a student from there. Whatever Martha Graham personally represented in the 1970s and 1980s or 1960s, whatever she may have said or may not have said, she had an extraordinary company of dancers. And that these dancers, she had an organization of teachers behind her, a technique. She had an eye for dancers, and she was able to keep building her company, and it would go through multiple things so that each decade a dance company looks different. And this also speaks something, I think, especially in terms of female bodies, to to audiences. The extraordinary carriage, the strength of the back, and certain other things, even apart from the actual stories that are told, which can be invested by dancers with all kinds of other stories and echoes and traces. And I think some of that is what was conveyed quite apart from who Martha Graham was having cocktails with.
Absolutely.
Okay, one more question there, unless you've already spoken. No seconds now.
Yeah, I just want to say again something about the dance community during this period, that was a way that dancers could earn a living. That was a very important thing for Martha Graham to be doing also, was to be trying to find ways for her dancers to work. And I want to second what you were saying, Lynn, about where the power is, and I want to make a tie-in, I think, to some of the more overtly political dances that Graham did in the 1930s, like Chronicle, which are very much are very popular now. But you see that there is such power in the female body and what the body is doing, and that power is when you see it on stage, it's in the body, but there's a larger psychological spread to it, and that's what I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ellen. I want to thank Ellen Graff because she was one of my early mentors in all of this. So I appreciate it. And I think, I feel like I want to kind of help out or help round this out by saying Martha Graham was a genius. I was in that. I mean, just as many of us were there, she was a genius. These works are pieces of genius. And there's a great saying from the 1930s. There's a Soviet cartoon, and what it says is, good art is good propaganda, and bad art is bad propaganda. Which I think, the reason it worked, and she worked because they were genius, because they were good. And I think, in essence, that's what this is about.
Okay, well, thank you. This is very exciting. And the book is here. And there are more books there. And Victoria and the rest of us will stay for a few minutes. So if you have questions for the author, let's go. And so here's